Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and that Rishi Sunak doesn't understand voters is evident. I could go over example after example of how he's failed to chime with his own key voters, but the data is ample evidence. After a brief post-trust bounce from Sunak, he's taken both his own and his party's poll rating down and down and down, to the point where it's now as low as it was for Liz Truss. But a lot of people, especially Conservatives, have this idea that Boris Johnson was in tune with voters, that he did understand them. But this was never the case. He gathered to him experts in campaigning and did as they advised him. But he has never been in tune with public thinking himself. And his latest pronouncements demonstrate this as well. Johnson has launched an epic barrage against Rishi Sunak for his policy on phasing in a smoking ban. Johnson said it was absolute madness. The party of Winston Churchill, who famously liked a cigar or two, who wants to ban cigars, absolutely outrageous. Now, a little aside, I noticed that Boris Johnson is saying we should keep smoking because Churchill liked to smoke, but he didn't invent smoking or even cigars. His only association with it is he occasionally smoked. Actually, he probably smoked quite a bit. He did, however, effectively invent the European Convention on Human Rights. There's no tirade from Johnson against those calling for us to pull out of yet another of the small number of good things which Churchill brought into the world. Almost like Johnson is a steaming hypocrite. But he is also out of tune with voters. A survey carried out last summer as Sunak was announcing this new smoking policy found that the majority supported the phasing out of the smoking. Now, as I keep saying, majority public opinion counts for nothing, of course, because our electoral system prioritises some voters over others. So not everyone has an equal say, which is why we need electoral reform. But what's surprising is that a significantly larger proportion of Conservative voters support the policy than even the general population. So Conservative voters are especially supportive of this move, which Boris Johnson is raging against. And this is not the first time Johnson has exposed himself as having no idea what voters want. In fact, ultimately, the reason he was ousted was not betrayal. It was because he kept doing or saying things that almost seemed calculated to enrage the party's important voters. In 2020, at the height of the pandemic, he was going to withdraw funding for kids in poverty from receiving like free school meal payments over the summer. Now, free school meals are not usually provided over the summer because there's no school, but the nature of the pandemic had shone a bit of a spotlight on poverty for a brief time. A prime minister with his finger on the pulse, even a Tory prime minister, would have been aware of this and slipstreamed alongside public opinion. But he didn't. Bereft of the campaign experts who make him seem in tune during elections, he reverted to type. Let them starve was his policy, and he made his MPs publicly defend that policy on various grounds, which many duly did. After all, this was Boris Johnson, the man who won the biggest Tory victory since Thatcher. He must know what he's doing. Only, of course, he didn't. He eventually had to U-turn on the policy after a huge public backlash, making all those Tory MPs who backed it looked both heartless and stupid. They'd backed a cruel policy that backfired. Some Tory MPs had not publicly defended the policy, indeed had written to their constituents saying they were fighting for a U-turn. How do I know? Because my Tory MP at the time wrote to me saying this. Oh yes, this is the wrong policy. I'm trying to work on it. Don't you worry. These are the MPs who came out of that affair with some credit. The ones who forced Johnson to U-turn. The ones who backed Johnson ended up looking like right tits. And this sort of thing kept happening. There were other minor examples, then the big one, not Partygate. The Owen Paterson scandal. Owen Paterson, Tory MP, had been caught out in very corrupt behaviour. He was going to be suspended from the Commons. Boris Johnson was persuaded to do all he could to protect Paterson. Now, the easiest way would have been to get Tory MPs to simply vote down the suspension, but the story was chiming with the public. A lot of Tory MPs go, no, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to lose a load more votes for the sake of that scoundrel. So Johnson pushed the nuclear button. He tried to claim that the Standards Committee was not fit for purpose and whipped his MPs to disband it. You know the saying, who watches the Watchmen? Well, the Standards Committee watches MPs, and Johnson had just disbanded it. The public outcry was immense. It certainly took Boris Johnson by surprise, so much for finger on the pulse. Within a couple of days, Jacob Rees-Mogg was dispatched to the House of Commons, tail between his legs, in order to reverse the decision, which of course meant another vote in Parliament. All deeply embarrassing, and even without Partygate was the beginning of the end for Boris Johnson. By this point, he'd made his MPs back dreadfully unpopular policies about half a dozen times, I think, only to have to U-turn when the public backlash caught him by surprise. He kept having this attitude, oh no, it'll be fine, they'll get over it, we'll get through it, put our heads down. Never happened. He simply had no idea how strongly the public felt about these issues. Now, this is not the MO of a Prime Minister with their finger on the pulse of public opinion. This is not a man in tune with voters. This is a man who can follow direction during an election campaign from strategists who are in tune with the public. But once it's over and those advisors are no longer part of his day-to-day team, he soon starts making decisions which put voters off. Because Boris Johnson has absolutely nothing in common with the average voter, even the average Conservative voter. Not just because of his background and lifestyle, but even in thought and philosophy, he is markedly different. It is testimony to their political naivety that a seemingly large number of Conservative MPs and party members think that Johnson would have had any chance of winning the next election, even if it weren't for the Privileges Committee investigation that would have been impossible if he'd been better advised. As far as Partygate is concerned, all Johnson had to do was admit the facts as they were clearly going to become known. Say, look, there was no ill intent, we're working really hard, all the usual stuff he came out with anyway, but not deny the facts of the matter. Accept, look, this looks really bad, I've let people down, I'm very sorry, I should have done better, I should have realised, I didn't realise, I'm sorry, and he would have gotten away with it. Just a show of contrition, that's basically all anyone wanted, would have killed the story. Most of what came out later wouldn't have come out because he'd have admitted to everything that was reported, meaning there would have been no need for investigations turning other things up. And more importantly, meaning no lies being told in Parliament, which ended up sealing his fate. The Tories could have avoided putting Liz Truss in charge of the country, and maybe they'd have stuck with Johnson as the only credible leader until the election. They would still be on course for losing because the same economic decisions would have been made. Schools and hospitals would still have collapsed without any remedy. The NHS waiting list would still have skyrocketed. The housing crisis would still be there. He'd still be making a big fuss of immigration feeding Reform UK. In fact, with Boris Johnson still in place, it seems doubtful we would have had anything like the Windsor framework. So we may have ended up with a trade war by now as well, making things actually even worse than Sunak has managed. But the poll gap may not have been as high. The Tories may have been looking at a sort of reverse position of Labour in 2019, rather than the much worse defeat the Conservatives themselves suffered in 1997, or worse still, 1906. And I think it's probably very, very unlikely that they would be looking at a Canada 1993 style wipeout. But all of these ifs and buts were never credible because Boris Johnson is not and has never been in tune with voters. He doesn't even like voters. He's a very lazy man as well. So, even someone who's very, very different to the average voter, as many of us are, can have an intellectual curiosity and put in the work to try and understand other people's point of view. He's far too lazy. He adopted a persona worked on over many years with special advisors who were paid specifically to create this image. Didn't even call it, he's Alex. He's not Boris, he's Alex, but he created this character, Boris Johnson. He made sure he had the best strategic advice during election campaigns. Remember that when he first tried to become Mayor of London, his campaign was crashing and burning. He's finished. He was out of it. Then he took on Isaac Levidow, completely turned things around. And even then, had Ken Livingstone seen and adapted to the new campaign style, he could still have beaten Johnson. Johnson has always benefited from world-class campaign strategists and opponents who didn't quite take him seriously enough. but he ran out of road this Parliament. His behaviour was so badly out of tune with voters that they took notice. All of a sudden, he was up against someone taking him seriously. You know, the Prime Minister faces way more scrutiny than the Mayor of London as well. You know, being on message only during an election campaign doesn't really cut it at this level. And it's incredible that Conservatives can't see this. And yet they can't. And as a result, have found one more thing to weaken themselves. A civil war between those who think Boris Johnson was betrayed and between those who recognise that he betrayed them. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.